Chapter 1. I wrote a number in my diary, 3, then circled it heavily with a red pen. 3 years of marriage, and this is Christopher Nolan's third lover. Also, the only one daring enough to appear before me. Just as I put the diary away and locked the drawer, a knock on the door echoed. Victoria Young, dressed in a secretary's uniform and wearing oversized black-rimmed glasses, walked in. "Madam, Mr. Nolan asked me to fetch a new tie." She stood before me, her demeanor timid and fearful. She looked honest and simple, even obedient. But the unbuttoned collar of her white shirt revealed a trail of glaring red kiss marks. As I stood up to get the tie, I accidentally noticed her black stockings had a large, conspicuous tear. "I'm sorry, madam. It was careless of me." Victoria Young quickly used her hand to cover the torn part of her stockings. "I accidentally ripped it while getting out of the car." Her eyes reddened, her expression a mix of fear and panic, evoking a sense of pity. I said nothing and handed her the tie. Victoria Young bowed her head, accepted it, and left. An hour later, a familiar overseas account sent me a message. "Today, Mr. Nolan and I unlocked 2 new locations. The CEO's office and the back seat of the Bentley van. Mr. Nolan seems to love thrilling places like the office. We did it 3 times. You must have noticed, right? My stockings were torn by him. In the van, we tried a new position. I didn't like it much, it hurt a bit. But Mr. Nolan was overjoyed and said we'd try again tonight. Mrs. Thompson, I'll update you again tonight." I put the phone down and, after a long while, stiffly turned to look out the window. The garden in the afternoon exuded a lazy charm. Not far away, on the rock by the lake, 2 large words were engraved, "Thompson Manor." Below, it was a small line of text handwritten by Christopher Nolan, "Bring the beauty into Thompson Manor, wishing for a lifetime of happiness. I am Catherine Thompson, the wife of Christopher Nolan. When he was 7 years old, he said he would build a golden house to marry me. He kept his promise. Later, when we got married, he gave me Thompson Manor, worth billions, as a wedding gift. Everyone in Capital City knows Christopher Nolan loves his wife as his life. I am his taboo, his untouchable weakness. He even loves to show off everywhere, saying Catherine Thompson is the rose he has nurtured since childhood. A beauty unmatched, irreplaceable." But now, I lowered my head with a cold smile, wiping away the tears that had long turned icy. Standing up, I walked into the bathroom. Removing the clothes on my body, I meticulously documented every mole on my skin. The faint hollow at my waist and the small cinnabar mole at the back of my neck. Afterward, I sent an email. The response came quickly, "Mrs. Thompson, we are finalizing the information you have provided. Please wait patiently." Every email self-destructed after being read. After showering and taking a short nap, I received a call from Christopher Nolan. He said he would take me to dine at a newly opened private restaurant tonight. When we arrived, Christopher Nolan personally came out to greet me. Behind him were his assistant, driver, and secretary. Victoria Young was also present, still in her usual unremarkable appearance, blending into the crowd. "Wife, you look stunning today." Christopher Nolan smiled and stepped forward to embrace me. Even as we sat down at the table, he didn't glance at Victoria Young even once. The table was filled with dishes I loved. But looking at the man sitting across from me, everything felt tasteless. "Not to your liking?" Christopher Nolan frowned and stood up. "I'll head to the kitchen and see if there's anything new." He gently placed his hand on my shoulder. "Wait for me, okay?" However, he was gone for over an hour before returning. When he came back, his tie was slightly askew, his shirt wrinkled, and near the zipper of his black trousers was a dark stain, as if it had just been dampened. He frowned, looking annoyed. "A server spilled wine on me earlier. Such a mood killer." The kitchen didn't have anything new either, just the same old dishes. "Wife, should we go somewhere else?" I shook my head. "I'm full. Let's go home." As we stepped outside, I saw Victoria Young in the crowd again. She bowed her head, as humble as ever. But I noticed her lips were slightly swollen, her lipstick smudged. Moreover, her stockings were gone. Once we got in the car, a message from Victoria Young's private account popped up. It seems Mr. Nolan couldn't hold back and unlocked a new location just now. Right in the private room next to yours. Mrs. Thompson, did you hear anything? What a pity, though. Time was tight, and Mr. Nolan didn't seem fully satisfied. What do you think, Mrs. Thompson? Will Mr. Nolan come looking for me again tonight? When I finished showering and came out, Christopher Nolan was sitting on the sofa, his expression somewhat distracted. Wife, stood up, his face showing a hint of guilt, looking at me as if he wanted to speak but then stopped himself. Is there something urgent at the company? I casually gave him an excuse. Yeah, something urgent, but it's not serious. He spoke, then sat back down. Besides, it's been a while since I spent time with you. Leaning against the dressing table, I gave him a faint smile and looked at him. Wait until Mom's death anniversary, then you can spend time with me. Christopher Nolan's eyes immediately filled with gentle pity. All right, by then I'll take leave and bring you to Switzerland, okay? I looked at him. A man nearing 30, more mature and charming compared to his younger days. When he looked at me, his eyes were full of my reflection. Even more intense and profound than when he was younger. I could barely suppress the cold smile hidden behind my eyes. All right, go ahead, don't keep others waiting. Christopher Nolan reluctantly stepped out the door. But his footsteps down the stairs were so quick. I stood by the large window, watching his car speed away. Not long after, a message from Victoria Young came through. Mr. Nolan was in such a rush, didn't even bother using protection, but the feeling was truly different. Mrs. Thompson, it seems your husband now fully belongs to me. In truth, the time that has passed has been enough for me to digest everything and face it calmly. Yet, at this moment, Victoria Young still managed to stir up my emotions. I sat down on the bedroom carpet, trembling all over. My right index finger unconsciously scratched at the skin of my thumb. I scratched so deeply that nail marks were imprinted, but I felt no pain. My stomach churned in waves, wanting to vomit, but only dry heaves came, nothing more. I propped myself up on the bed to stand, my head spinning for a long moment, before swallowing a handful of pills. It took a while before I could reluctantly regain a bit of composure. I dialed the number again for a second time. Hello, Miss Thompson, is there something you need? The person on the other end picked up quickly, their voice low and calm, offering an oddly comforting reassurance. Can you help me move the plan forward? How much earlier do you want it? Just after my mother's death anniversary, is that possible? There was a brief silence on the other end. Miss Thompson, I'll do my best to meet your request. Thank you. Chapter 2. The next time I met Victoria Young was at a corporate wine reception. When I arrived, Christopher Nolan was bluntly scolding her, utterly clumsy, incapable of doing anything right. Get out. Everyone around looked at Victoria Young with eyes full of pity. Christopher Nolan's assistant leaned in and whispered to me, Madam, you might not know this, but Mr. Nolan absolutely despises that intern secretary. Her work performance is poor, she's dim-witted, and her looks are average, there's nothing remarkable about her at all. I smiled. Then why not fire her? The assistant was momentarily stunned. It seemed as though someone had brought this up before, but Mr. Nolan, apparently refused. He was about to explain further when Christopher Nolan noticed me and quickly walked over. Darling, did I scare you? I rarely lose my temper with employees, but that secretary is truly hopeless. I looked at him and gave a faint smile. She's new. Just take your time teaching her. Christopher Nolan sneered. My secretary isn't some incompetent, unworthy person who just happens to get in. I'll fire her after the holidays. I said nothing more, merely glancing in Victoria Young's direction. She stood among the staff, completely unremarkable. When her eyes met mine, she immediately lowered her head, but there was still a trace of defiance as she bit her lip. Midway through the party, Christopher Nolan led me to a lounge room before hurriedly leaving. Not long after, a message came from Victoria Young's alternate account, Mrs. Thompson, at the end of the hallway, the restroom. Would you like to go take a look? The entire floor was very quiet. Christopher Nolan had forbidden anyone from coming up to disturb me while I rested. But that only made things more convenient for him and Victoria Young. The door was slightly ajar, and inside came the sound of Victoria Young's muffled sobs. Along with that were heavy noises and vulgar words that were unbearable to hear. This was another despicable and filthy side of Christopher Nolan that I had never known. Mr. Nolan, please let me go, I can't take it anymore, Victoria pleaded. In response, Christopher Nolan's cold voice barked, take it from me. Mr. Nolan, can't you show me some compassion? Do you think you're worthy? Christopher Nolan sneered. I only care for my wife. Women like you, he said with disdain, are only fit for me to vent my anger on. Then go find your wife outside. Victoria Young sobbed, her cries choked with emotion. But Christopher Nolan grabbed her hair, forcing her to lift her face. Her voice gradually faded, becoming inaudible. Victoria Young, being a mistress, comes with the price of a mistress. I'm warning you, don't mention my wife. You're not even worthy to carry her shoes. Then don't touch me, don't do this to me. You say not to touch, yet you're undressed and seducing me. Victoria Young, aren't you cheap? Mr. Nolan. I really can't take it anymore, please let me go. My wife is in the next room, she'll hear us. Her cries suddenly grew louder. Then shut up. Victoria Young's voice once again softened. I turned around and went back to the lounge. Nearly an hour later, Christopher Nolan returned, his face filled with guilt. Christopher Nolan. I called out to him, my voice calm. In 2 days, it's my mother's death anniversary. Come with me to the mountain to pay respects. When she was alive, my mother adored Christopher Nolan. Before passing, she held my hand and placed it in his, only then did she close her eyes in peace. Now, I no longer need him. I must make it clear to my mother. This is not my fault. It's because he was already tainted. He doesn't deserve it. When I cried in front of my mother's grave, even Christopher Nolan shed tears. As always, he solemnly swore, saying he would love me for a lifetime, treat me well for a lifetime. But his promises couldn't stop the fact that, after receiving a phone call, he had to leave immediately in the middle of the night. Darling, I'll come to pick you up early in 2 days. This is urgent, I really can't be absent. Be good, okay? It's almost New Year's. This year, I'll take an early leave and spend time with you, alright? I lowered my head to adjust the bouquet of white chrysanthemums I planned to offer at my mother's grave. Word by word, I asked him, it's already so late. Do you really have to leave now? Christopher Nolan seemed to hesitate for 2 seconds, but eventually nodded. Sorry, Catherine, this is truly urgent. I understand. You work so hard, all for the sake of this family. You promised my mother that you would make me the happiest woman in the world, admired by everyone as Mrs. Nolan. Catherine, I can't break that promise. I held the bouquet and stood up, giving him one last deep look. But he was lowering his head, checking his watch. His brows furrowed tightly, clearly showing anxiety and impatience. Just go. Wait for me, I'll come back in 2 days. He stepped forward and hugged me tightly. Before I could push him away, he had already hurriedly turned and left. At 1 a.m., a message with an attached photo came from Victoria Young's small account. They were photos taken at Thompson Manor. The stone carvings, bearing the name Thompson Manor. The main house where we lived. The master bedroom occupying the entire second floor. And above the headboard hung the wedding photo of Christopher Nolan and me. My pillow was thrown onto the floor. Christopher Nolan was sound asleep, his hand resting on her chest. Thompson Manor, so renowned, yet only this much. I've entered Thompson Manor. Tell me, how many more times will Mr. Nolan break his vows for me? I still didn't respond. Just then, the phone rang. On the other end was the deep, steady voice of a man. Miss Thompson, everything is ready. You can leave Capital City forever now. Christopher Nolan ordered the butler to gather all the staff at Thompson Manor. Madam will return tomorrow. What happened in the past few days, you'd better keep it to yourselves and take it to the grave. You've all worked at Thompson Manor for 4 years, so you must know how much I love Catherine. Therefore, I don't want this minor mistake after a drunken night to reach her ears and hurt our marriage. No one dared to object, quickly nodding in agreement. Only then did Christopher Nolan feel satisfied, waving his hand to dismiss everyone. Victoria Young descended the stairs, wearing Catherine Thompson's nightgown. Christopher Nolan frowned. Who gave you permission to wear my wife's clothes? Take it off immediately. Victoria Young remained unfazed, flashing a provocative smile. All right, then I'll take it off. She loosened the strap, letting the nightgown slip down and pull at her feet. Underneath, she was dressed in a set of alluring lingerie. As expected, Christopher Nolan's expression changed instantly. Victoria Young smirked triumphantly, stepping down the stairs and sitting directly on his lap. Do you like it? Christopher Nolan's breathing quickened. Just as he flipped her over and pinned her down, his phone suddenly rang. Without even glancing at it, he hung up immediately. But the ringtone quickly sounded again. Victoria Young reached for the phone, silenced it, and tossed it aside. The stone engraved with the words Thompson Manor in the yard silently bore witness to the sordid scene on the first floor. It wasn't until Christopher Nolan's assistant rushed over in a panic. He stood outside, his face filled with worry. Mr. Nolan, we've just received news, something has happened to Madam. Christopher Nolan shoved Victoria Young aside and sat up abruptly. Samuel Green, if you dare spout nonsense again, try me. He sneered, picking up the cigarette box from the coffee table and lighting one. Casually, he tossed the blanket toward Victoria Young, only to snatch it back irritably. Get out right now. Victoria Young froze, wanting to say something, but the assistant was already on the verge of tears from urgency. It's true, Mr. Nolan. The incident happened just an hour ago. Madam's car plunged off a cliff, the impact was severe, and the fuel tank exploded. The entire car was completely burned. Christopher Nolan's hand, holding the cigarette, suddenly froze. His face turned pale, and his voice became hoarse, almost demonic. What did you say? Samuel Green, repeat that to me again. Mr. Nolan, Madam, has passed away. Before she died, her final call was to me. She said you wouldn't answer her calls. She asked me to tell you that she could never return to Thompson Manor again. Christopher Nolan felt as though all the sounds around him had disappeared. The whole world fell into an eerily unsettling silence. The cigarette slipped from his hand, burning a hole in the lace tablecloth. He trembled as he extinguished the flame, leaving behind a patch of ash beneath his fingers, dissipating like smoke. The car sped down the road as if flying. After the heavy rain, the sky was crystal clear. The winding road leading into the mountains twisted like a goat's intestine. Christopher Nolan leaned motionless against the back seat, as still as a wooden statue. The scene of the accident had been cordoned off by the police for further investigation. When Christopher Nolan arrived, he was unable to approach the site. At the same time, Catherine Thompson's lengthy suicide note, left behind in the mountain estate, had been made public. Christopher Nolan only learned of the letter's existence and contents through a mysterious livestream. In the letter, Catherine Thompson explicitly wrote, she did not allow him to attend her funeral. She forbade him from burying her ashes in the Nolan family cemetery. She prohibited him from involving himself in any matters following her death. She made it unmistakably clear, everything related to her, whether in life or death, would no longer have any connection to Christopher Nolan. She entrusted the auction of Thompson Manor, with all proceeds to be allocated to the charity fund for women and children. She also withdrew her personal seal and requested the Nolan Corporation's board of directors to adhere to the late patriarch's will by selecting someone else to inherit the family business. Years ago, he had knelt by the patriarch's sickbed for an entire day and night before receiving his approval, entrusting her life to him. However, the person originally chosen by the patriarch for her was not Christopher Nolan, the unremarkable fourth son of the Nolan family. It was only because of their childhood bond that the patriarch eventually nodded in agreement. Perhaps this is why the patriarch left behind a will. The next heir of the Nolan family could only be Catherine Thompson's husband. Chapter 3. Along with the suicide note, there were also several video clips from the surveillance cameras inside Thompson Manor. All the security monitoring equipment here was managed by Christopher Nolan's personnel. However, he never expected that she had secretly installed an additional surveillance system in Thompson Manor at some point. From the first floor of the main building to all the bedrooms on the second floor, every vile act between him and Victoria Young was exposed without any concealment. The image of a devoted husband, which Christopher Nolan had carefully built over 3 years, collapsed in an instant. A wave of public outrage surged, its intensity beyond imagination. Christopher Nolan's phone rang incessantly, and even the phones of his assistant and driver beside him buzzed as if demanding their lives. He stood outside the car, expressionless, casually turning off his phone. "Mr. Nolan." The assistant, drenched in sweat, spoke in panic. "The madam's suicide note has been made public. The impact is massive, incredibly severe. What should we do now? The PR team is waiting for your instructions." But Christopher Nolan seemed not to hear a word. His gaze was fixed solely on the charred remains of the van, now reduced to a steel frame not far away. It wasn't until the rescue team brought out the body that his eyelids twitched slightly. Then, disregarding everything, he dashed past the barricades and ran toward the stretcher. The scene descended into chaos as several police officers blocked his way, preventing him from getting closer. "I need to see with my own eyes that this is my wife's body." Christopher Nolan's bloodshot eyes locked onto the officer in front of him, gripping their arm tightly, refusing to back down even an inch. But in the end, he was still unable to see my body with his own eyes. In the suicide note, I clearly wrote, "Alive or dead, I never want to see him again." Even so, Christopher Nolan went to great lengths to obtain my autopsy report. He claimed he was my husband, the only man in my life. My body, every inch of my skin, every detail of my face, my figure, no one in this world knew it better than he did. At first, he managed to maintain his composure. But when Christopher Nolan saw the photos of my charred, unrecognizable corpse, he still identified the familiar traces: the small cinnabar mole behind my neck, the faint hollow on my lower back, the crescent-shaped scar on my left index finger, even the tiny mole on my chest, all matched perfectly. In that moment, Christopher Nolan's emotions completely collapsed. At the same time, on the large screen before him, the live broadcast of 24 hours before and after Catherine Thompson's death continued playing. It turned out the reason for my accident was Victoria Young incessantly sending harassing messages. I was driving alone back to Capital City to confront him. In a fit of rage and loss of control, I veered off course, crashed through the guardrails, and plunged into a deep ravine. When the car fell, it didn't explode immediately. I regained consciousness after a brief blackout, and the first call I made was to him. But he didn't answer. At that moment, he was passionately entangled with Victoria Young in the living room on the first floor. Later, the car exploded. I was trapped inside and perished in the flames and the blast. On the surveillance footage, the date and time were clearly displayed, perfectly matching the moment of the accident. The livestream went viral, causing a public uproar. Although it was late at night, a large crowd of angry protesters had already surrounded the exterior of the Nolan Corporation building. At Thompson Manor, the noise of people grew increasingly chaotic. At the same time, someone publicly revealed the charitable acts I had quietly carried out over the past 10 years. Each year, I donated millions of yuan to help women and children who were lost or homeless. I personally participated in civil relief organizations, reuniting 6 kidnapped children with their families. For 8 consecutive years, I funded the tuition fees for 300 impoverished children in mountainous regions without interruption. On the screen, images of my charitable efforts, captured by volunteers and those who had received my help, continuously appeared. It wasn't about glamorous dresses or dazzling makeup, but pure dedication and sincerity. Amid the embrace of the children, I smiled gently, radiating vitality. These images stood in stark and tragic contrast to the car plunging off a cliff, exploding, and burning to ashes. And my body, damaged, disfigured, half reduced to ash. I truly was the stunning rose that Christopher Nolan had always boasted about to everyone. But now, that rose had withered, fallen apart in his hands. So, how would he end up? The board of directors quickly made a decision. They would honor the wishes of the old master and Catherine Thompson. The next leader of the Nolan Corporation could only be Catherine Thompson's husband. As a result, Christopher Nolan was expelled from the board of directors, losing all inheritance rights. Yet, he stubbornly refused to return Catherine Thompson's personal seal. Catherine is my wife. She lived as my woman, and even in death, she remains my widow. In this life, I have only one wife, and that is her. Now that she's gone, I will not marry anyone else. In front of Christopher Nolan was an exquisitely crafted urn. He placed his hand on it, gently stroking it bit by bit. For the rest of my life, I will live alongside Catherine's ashes. This seal, I cannot hand it over to you. And as for the Nolan Corporation, my grandfather made it very clear, the Nolan Corporation can only be entrusted to Catherine Thompson's husband. Christopher Nolan looked at the crowd before him and gave a cold smile. You want to take it? Fine. Let Catherine come and tell me herself. Christopher Nolan, you know very well that Catherine is no longer here. Moreover, in her suicide note, she made it clear. Are you going to go against her final wishes and leave her restless even in death? Christopher Nolan clutched the urn tightly in his arms. As long as we are legally husband and wife, you have no right to take her seal. The crowd exchanged glances, unable to say a word. At that moment, Christopher Nolan's assistant suddenly burst in. He was holding a phone, his face pale and lifeless. Mr. Nolan. His voice was hoarse. Just now, Daniel Cross, the CEO of the Cross Corporation, sent you a legal letter. Christopher Nolan abruptly stood up. Daniel Cross? I've never had any conflict with him. Why would he send me a lawyer's letter? It's about the Madam. They're saying that a month ago, the Madam entrusted a lawyer to file for divorce from you. And the Madam's seal, along with the will left to her by the old master, are now in their possession. Christopher Nolan's pupils constricted. That's impossible. The seal has always been in the safe in my study. Just this morning, he had opened it to check, and the seal was still there. Mr. Nolan, the Madam took the seal a month ago. What's in your safe now is likely a fake. Christopher Nolan's eyes turned bloodshot as he stared intently at his assistant. So, Catherine Thompson had planned everything a month ago. She had known all along about his affair with Victoria Young. Then, could it be that from the very first moment Victoria Young approached him, she had intended for everything to come to light before Catherine Thompson? Where is Victoria Young? He gritted his teeth as he spat out her name. The assistant shook his head. The day the Madam had her accident, she fled. The company hasn't been able to contact her, and she hasn't returned to her rented apartment. Find her. Even if you have to turn the earth upside down, bring her to me. Mr. Nolan, what's most important now is what you're going to do, how you'll handle this crisis. The assistant looked at him helplessly. I heard that the second young master has returned from abroad. The two were half-brothers, yet their mothers were sworn enemies, locked in a life-and-death rivalry since their youth. Back then, if Catherine hadn't chosen him, Christopher Nolan would never have had the chance to surpass his second brother, a man known for his ruthlessness and decisiveness in everything he did. In recent years, everything had gone smoothly for Christopher Nolan, making him forget how he and his mother had once been suffocated under the oppression of William Nolan and his mother. The pain and helplessness from those days now seemed to resurface like a haunting nightmare. But at this moment, there was no turning back anymore. The private jet landed on an unnamed island. As the staff guided me down the stairs, I immediately saw a man standing not far away. Behind him were several assistants and secretaries, all standing solemnly, following him respectfully. The wind blew fiercely across the vast airport. The hem of his long coat flapped wildly in the wind. The coat opened slightly, revealing a shirt of the same tone and black trousers underneath. He appeared tall, with a lean yet well-proportioned figure. A fleeting guess crossed my mind, but I couldn't be certain. The person who has always been in contact with me via phone and email turns out to be such a young and handsome man? Miss Thompson, this is Mr. Cross. The entire plan this time has been personally overseen by Mr. Cross. I froze mid-step. Mr. Cross? Is it Mr. Cross from the Cross Corporation of Serenity Ventures? The person accompanying me nodded with a smile. That's him. Chapter 4. I couldn't help but be astonished. The Cross Corporation in the capital city circle was on a completely different level. With a history of 100 years of development and deeply rooted foundations, even the Nolan family could only admire them from afar. But thinking about it, to undertake such a bold and groundbreaking plan, perhaps only the Cross Corporation had the capability. So, this private resort island, Mr. Cross said you are the first client. This is a token of appreciation for you. Miss Thompson, for the next year, the entire ownership of this island will belong to you. You can rest assured and enjoy your vacation. The person accompanying me finished speaking and then directed the workers to move my luggage. At that moment, Daniel Cross also approached me. I tried to suppress the storm of emotion surging within and politely nodded to greet him. Daniel Cross extended his hand. Miss Thompson, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Daniel Cross. Catherine Thompson. I reached out, and he lightly shook my hand with great courtesy before letting go. I've had all the facilities on the island thoroughly inspected. As for security, Miss Thompson, you can be completely at ease. Daniel Cross looked at me, his voice steady and calm, just like over the phone. Of course, if you stay here too long and feel bored, you can use your passport to travel to neighboring countries anytime. Mr. Cross, isn't this too extravagant? I felt a bit uneasy. After all, I had only paid $1 million before this. Daniel Cross smiled faintly. Miss Thompson, you are the first client. Your case's success holds immense significance for me. At this point, I didn't want to overthink anymore. After all, the reputation of the Cross Corporation was guarantee enough. I didn't think they needed anything more from me. Then, I gladly accept this kindness, Mr. Cross. Miss Thompson, I wish you a pleasant holiday. I couldn't help but smile. If Mr. Cross can swiftly win the divorce case, I'll be even happier. Daniel Cross looked at me, his gaze deep and resolute. Rest assured, Miss Thompson, I will give it my all. Then I'll wait for your good news. The good news came faster than I expected. Public pressure mounted, and William Nolan returned with great momentum. After the old master's will and my seal were revealed, Christopher Nolan had no way out. Previously, he clung to my ashes day and night, perhaps still trying to portray the image of a devoted husband. Christopher Nolan desperately tried to salvage public opinion. But unfortunately for him, Victoria Young made her entrance. She released several audio recordings. Most of them were Christopher Nolan's words when he was drunk. Am I not doing well enough? Look across all of Capital City, is there any man who loves his wife as much as I do? Married to her for 3 years, I've only kept 3 mistresses. And those women are merely for me to relieve stress, just for fun. No one dares to bother her, and no one can make her uncomfortable. Victoria Young, that includes you. Let me tell you, all of you combined are not worth a single strand of my wife's hair. Victoria Young asked, if you love her that much, why sleep with me? Because I can't bear it. Can't bear what? Because the filthy things I can do with you, I can't bear to do with her. I can't bear to lay a hand on her. I can't bear for her to be like you, degraded to cater to my desires. A wife is to be loved, to be respected. But you're not. You are just tools for me to vent. What right do you have to compare yourself to my wife? Hearing this, it truly sounded like he loved her deeply and attentively. But it was also truly ironic. Even so, when I heard these words, my heart was completely calm. Victoria Young's recordings did not spread widely. Not even a trace could be found online. I vaguely guessed that this was definitely due to Daniel Cross's intervention. Because if these recordings spread, I would be dragged back into the storm, becoming a topic of public gossip once again. Christopher Nolan's final hope also shattered. The image of a loving husband completely collapsed. The good impressions he had once built with important partners vanished. Even influential figures placed him on a blacklist, declaring they would never collaborate with him again. Under mounting pressure, Christopher Nolan was forced to step back and sign his name. Thompson Manor was successfully auctioned off to a mysterious buyer. The estate began to be demolished for reconstruction. The once magnificent and glorious past was now reduced to ashes, everything completely closed. Daniel Cross flew in from thousands of miles away, bringing important documents to me. At that moment, it was sunset, the sunlight red as blood, spreading across the sea. Half the water reflected a deep blue, while the other half glowed in fiery red. I looked at the small certificate in my hand, tears silently falling. I sat alone on a rock by the sea, crying for a long, long time. Until the sea breeze turned cold, drying the traces of tears on my face. At that moment, a warm coat was draped over my shoulders. I turned around, and through blurry vision, I saw the face of Daniel Cross. Under the night sky, his expression was gentle and profound, like his voice, bringing a sense of calm to others. A year later, I left that private island. Starting the journey of traveling around the world, step by step fulfilling the dreams of my youth. News from back home still occasionally reaches me. Christopher Nolan is now living in utter misery. In Capital City, at the Nolan household, he no longer has a place. He began drinking heavily, plunging into gambling. In the end, he squandered what was left of his inheritance. He even accumulated a massive debt, so overwhelming it felt suffocating. As for Victoria Young, the last time she appeared in public was when she followed a new wealthy benefactor to the Philippines. It's said that man already had a wife and children back home, so naturally, he couldn't give her a proper title. But if she were to establish herself in the Philippines, perhaps she could find her own path. However, not long after, the man returned to his country alone. Since then, there's been no news of Victoria Young, as if she vanished from the world. Thompson Manor has begun reconstruction. The artificial lake was filled in, and the stone engraved with Thompson Manor along with those ridiculous love vows was hauled away and destroyed. Both the interior and exterior have been completely transformed. Only the words Thompson Manor on the main gate remain unchanged. The handwriting there looks oddly familiar, very much resembling Daniel Cross's strokes. Over the past year, while being by his side, I've noticed quite a few things. But for me now, romantic relationships are no longer on my mind. I just want to live freely, lightly like the wind, and pursue a life of my own. I've hinted or even directly expressed my thoughts and feelings to Daniel Cross. He's a smart man, of course, he understands me. Therefore, he never had any actions or words that crossed the line, making me feel uncomfortable. But Daniel Cross didn't know that, in fact, there was one time when I went into his study to return a book and accidentally dropped a box. Inside the box were many photos. They were photos I had taken and sent to him via email. The small vermilion mark on my neck. The faint hollow of my lower back. The brown mole on my chest. The crescent-shaped scar on my index finger. Chapter 5. Each photo was meticulously stored inside. I had no idea when he had quietly printed and kept them. At first, I was truly surprised. Because those emails were all set to self-destruct after being read. I never intended to leave behind any trace. But when I saw those photos, beyond the astonishment and surprise, I didn't feel uncomfortable or offended. Perhaps it was because Daniel Cross was so exceptionally noble, so exceptionally courteous. Even though he had silently crossed the line to do something like this, it somehow felt entirely forgivable. I didn't tell anyone about this. I simply placed the box back where it was. But I took all the photos and burned them. When I left the island, I sent him a message, asking him to destroy the originals and any copies. Daniel Cross took quite a while to reply. Perhaps this was the first time he wasn't courteous in responding to a woman's request. Catherine, I'm sorry about the photos. But truly, can't I keep even just one? They're all I have of you from the past 6 years. I was sitting on the plane. The plane was about to take off. I felt my cheeks heat up, unable to resist pressing the back of my hand against them to cool down. I lowered my head to look at the phone screen, unlocking and locking it repeatedly. Finally, I opened the message box and replied to him. Mr. Cross, you may keep the one with the scarred finger. The rest, please destroy. Daniel Cross replied very quickly, as you wish. I turned my phone face down, choosing not to reply further. As the plane took off, his final message came through, Catherine, when can I visit you? On the 10th anniversary of my mother's passing, I quietly returned to my home country. The return itinerary was arranged by Daniel Cross, and the hotel I stayed in was part of the Cross Corporation's chain. Daniel Cross once told me I was his first client, and his after-sales service was lifelong. Thinking of the photos he had once kept, I smiled and agreed. The day I visited my mother's grave, he had already sent someone to clean up the burial site in advance. Over the years, Christopher Nolan still came to visit my mother's grave annually. This year was likely no exception. But unfortunately, he wasn't even allowed to step onto the mountain, let alone approach my mother's grave to see me. As in previous years, I stayed on the mountain for 2 days. During the day, I spent time by my mother's grave, rearranging the withered bouquets and clearing the overgrown weeds. I stayed there until evening, then slowly walked back alone. Those 2 days, I thought a lot, and for the first time in many years, my heart felt an unusual sense of peace. A person's life is the sum of countless choices. I paid a high price for the decisions I made in my youth. But it was precisely those decisions that opened the door to a new beginning. I am not a saint, nor am I a celestial being. I cannot foresee whether each of my choices will be right or wrong. But I live without shame in my conscience. On the day I left, I gently wiped my mother's photo one last time. She smiled tenderly, full of love, making even the passing breeze feel soft. I stood up, turned my back, and saw Daniel Cross. During the long years I traveled everywhere, he often called or emailed me, asking, Catherine, can I come visit you? But every time I refused. It was much later that I learned he had always silently followed my footsteps. Every country, every city I had visited, he had been there too. Yet he never let me know, nor did he ever disturb me. Are you planning to stay in the country for a while? I shook my head. No, I won't stay. Then, where's your next destination? Daniel Cross tilted his head, looking at me. I kept my gaze forward, not turning back to him, only giving a faint smile. I want to return to that little island and stay a few more days. Daniel Cross's steps faltered for a moment. Catherine? I paused, slowly turned to look at him, my smile softening my eyes. Mr. Cross, I wonder if your after-sales service includes this. The sun rose above the high mountains, breaking through the clouds to shine brightly. Its rays, like scattered golden dust, fell into his eyes from afar. In those eyes, a smile gradually appeared. Catherine, that island has had your name on it from the very beginning. Christopher Nolan's mood was becoming increasingly unstable. On the 10th anniversary of his mother Catherine Thompson's death, he had planned to personally visit her grave. However, the mountain was sealed off that day, and he couldn't take another step forward. It was said that an important figure had returned to visit their relatives. At first, he didn't pay much attention. But when the luxurious convoy departed, he seemed to catch a glimpse of Catherine Thompson. The convoy stopped at the foot of the mountain for about 10 minutes. Initially, Christopher Nolan only recognized Daniel Cross, the mysterious and reserved heir of the Cross family. Later, he saw Daniel Cross step out of the car himself, respectfully welcoming a young woman. Surrounding them were numerous bodyguards. Christopher Nolan only caught a fleeting glance. But in that single moment, his heart nearly stopped. He and Catherine Thompson had grown up together. They had loved each other for 3 years and been married for another 3. How could he not recognize his own wife? But everyone knew, Catherine Thompson had died in a tragic car accident. He himself had seen the autopsy photos with his own eyes. Every detail matched perfectly, leaving no room for error. But how could there be 2 people in this world who looked so alike? And why would she appear on the anniversary of her mother's death? A crazy and irrational thought arose in Christopher Nolan's mind. Could it be that Catherine Thompson had faked her death to take revenge on him? Because in this world, aside from him, the one who knew her body best, only she herself would truly know. Therefore, deceiving him wasn't really that difficult. As this thought emerged, Christopher Nolan gradually sank into madness and obsession. He began keeping vigil at the cemetery where Catherine Thompson's mother was buried. Then, he moved to the newly built Thompson Manor, staying there through the nights. Every place he thought Catherine Thompson might appear, Christopher Nolan sought out. But there were no results. His mental state deteriorated further. Every night, he dreamt. In his dreams, Catherine Thompson returned to find him, but not as the gentle, beautiful figure she once was. She appeared with a charred body, a disfigured face, incomplete limbs, or a horrifying skeletal visage, blood and tears streaming from her 7 orifices. Under this torment day after day, Christopher Nolan's spirit eventually collapsed completely. One day, while driving out to escape his debts, he crashed straight into a highway barrier. He didn't die on the spot, but he was left completely paralyzed from the neck down, barely clinging to life in the hospital for nearly a year before finally succumbing to ultimate agony. No one handled his funeral after his death. After cremation, his ashes were left abandoned in storage, with no one willing to pay to lay him to rest. On the day Christopher Nolan passed away, on a small island in a distant country, fireworks lit up the entire sky, lasting throughout the night. In the night as bright as day, a handsome and gentle man leaned down to kiss the woman he loved. Amid the bustling, lively sounds, the sea breeze softly carried his whisper, "Catherine, I've wanted to kiss this beauty mark of yours thousands upon thousands of times."